Professor Daniel Brooks did not speak immediately, and that was the first sign that something was deeply wrong with the version of reality he had always trusted, because men like him always had something to say, always had an answer, always had control. Yet now he stood there in front of his own class, staring at the board as if it had betrayed him, his eyes moving from one line of Emily Carter's solution to the next, searching, dissecting, trying to locate the mistake that would restore the natural order of things. But the mistake never appeared, and the longer he looked, the more undeniable the truth became. Her solution was not only correct, it was refined, cleaner than the method he had demonstrated in previous lectures, more efficient in a way that suggested not just understanding, but mastery, and a subtle shift passed through the room, the kind that could not be reversed. Students who had been leaning back now sat forward. Those who had whispered now remained silent, and a low tension filled the air as if everyone was waiting for Professor Brooks to reassert control, to explain this away, to reframe what they had just witnessed into something that fit their expectations. But when he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, less certain. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Emily, who had stepped slightly away from the board, turned just enough to face him, her expression calm, almost neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "I have studied on my own," she replied, her tone even, respectful, but not apologetic, and that answer seemed to unsettle him even more, because it offered no easy explanation, no institution to credit, no authority to validate what he was seeing, just her, standing there in a gray cardigan, holding nothing but quiet confidence. And a student in the front row raised his hand hesitantly, something that had never happened during one of Brooks's demonstrations. "Professor," he said, his voice careful, "her solution skips a step, but it still works. Actually, it removes the redundancy from the substitution you showed last week." And the words hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an observation. And for the first time, Professor Brooks found himself on the receiving end of the kind of scrutiny he had built his reputation on, his jaw tightening slightly as he turned back to the board, following the logic again, slower this time, more deliberately, and the realization settled in, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something he could not stop even if he wanted to. And behind him, Emily remained still, not shifting, not filling the silence, simply waiting. And that quiet presence carried more weight than any argument could have, because she was not trying to prove anything anymore. She already had, and the room felt different now, not just silent, but aware, as if every person in it understood that they had just witnessed something rare, something that did not fit into the neat categories they were used to. And Professor Brooks exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did little to hide the tension beneath it. "That approach," he began, choosing his words carefully now, "is not standard." But even as he said it, it sounded weaker than he intended, because everyone could see the truth written across the board, and Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes returning briefly to the solution before she spoke again. "No, it is not standard," she said, "but it reduces the number of transformations and avoids the instability in the boundary condition." And her words landed with quiet precision, not aggressive, not defensive, just factual, and a ripple of recognition moved through the class. The same point she had tried to raise earlier now fully realized in her work, and Professor Brooks froze for a fraction of a second, his mind catching up to the implication that she had not only solved the problem, she had identified a flaw in his original explanation and corrected it without ever raising her voice, without ever seeking attention. And that was the moment everything shifted completely. Because this was no longer about a student being unexpectedly competent. This was about a hierarchy being quietly dismantled in front of everyone who believed in it. And no one spoke, no one laughed, no one even moved, because the silence had transformed into something else entirely, something heavier, something that carried respect whether anyone was ready to admit it or not. And as Professor Brooks finally stepped back from the board, his posture no longer relaxed, his confidence no longer absolute. There was only one undeniable truth left in the room. The person he had chosen to underestimate had just redefined the standard he believed only he could set. No one dared to break the silence that followed, because it no longer belonged to Professor Daniel Brooks. It belonged to the moment itself, And moments like that did not need words to be understood. They demanded reflection, and for the first time in that lecture hall, the authority that had always defined the room felt uncertain, as if it had shifted from one place to another without anyone announcing it. And Brooks, who had spent years controlling every discussion, every answer, every conclusion, now found himself standing in front of something he could not easily contain, his eyes lingering on the board before slowly turning back to Emily Carter, studying her in a way he had not before, not as an inconvenience, not as a mistake in the room, but as a variable he had completely miscalculated. And his voice, when it came again, carried a restraint that had not existed earlier. "You said you studied on your own," he repeated, as if trying to reconstruct the narrative into something that made sense to him. And Emily gave a small nod, her posture unchanged, her calm unshaken. "Yes, sir," she answered, and there was no elaboration, no attempt to impress, just a simple truth delivered without decoration. And that simplicity unsettled him more than any complex explanation could have, because it left no room for him to reassert control, no weakness to point to, no gap to exploit. And somewhere in the room, a student shifted in his seat, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness, while another leaned forward, eyes fixed on Emily with a kind of attention that had not been there before, not curiosity now, but recognition. And Professor Brooks took a slow step toward the board, as if proximity might restore his authority, his hand lifting slightly as though he might correct something, anything, but it hovered there for a moment before lowering again, because there was nothing to correct. And that realization settled heavily across his expression, subtle but unmistakable, and he cleared his throat, a small, controlled sound that echoed more than expected. "Well," he began, choosing each word carefully, "while your method is unconventional, it does appear to reach the correct conclusion." And even that phrasing felt like a compromise, an attempt to maintain some semblance of hierarchy. But the class heard what he could not avoid saying, that she was right. And the acknowledgement, however restrained, landed with quiet force. And Emily did not react with pride or satisfaction. She simply inclined her head slightly, as if accepting something that had never been in question for her. And that was when the shift became complete, because the room no longer saw her as someone out of place. They saw her as someone who had been underestimated, and the difference between those two perceptions was everything. And Professor Brooks, sensing that change, even if he could not fully accept it, moved to regain control in the only way he knew how. "Perhaps," he said, his tone sharpening just enough to re-establish structure, "you would care to explain your reasoning to the class." And it was framed as an opportunity. But beneath it lay a test, one last attempt to place her back into a position where she could falter, because solving a problem was one thing, teaching it was another. And he watched her closely, expecting hesitation this time, expecting uncertainty. But Emily simply turned back to the board, her gaze moving across the solution she had already written, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, and carried across the room without strain. "The original substitution introduces an unnecessary layer," she began, her tone calm, almost conversational, as if she were not addressing a room full of people who had doubted her just minutes ago. "If you reduce it at the boundary condition, you can simplify the transformation and avoid the instability that appears in the third step." And as she spoke, she gestured lightly to the relevant sections of the equation, her explanation precise without being complicated, her reasoning unfolding in a way that was not only correct, but accessible. And the students listened, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand. And that was something Professor Brooks had always demanded but rarely achieved. And as Emily continued, the realization deepened, not just for him, but for everyone in the room, that what they were witnessing was not luck, not memorization, not a single impressive moment, but a level of understanding that could not be dismissed or explained away. And when she finished, she stepped back again, the chalk resting quietly on the ledge, her hands returning to her sides. And once more, the room fell into silence. But this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but respectful. And Professor Brooks stood there, facing not just a solved equation, but the undeniable truth that the quiet woman he had tried to diminish had just taught his class something he had not. And in doing so, had changed the way every person in that room would see her from that moment on. The silence did not break immediately after Emily Carter finished speaking, because what she had done lingered in the air, settling into every corner of the lecture hall, reshaping the unspoken assumptions that had existed just minutes before. And for the first time, the students were not looking at Professor Daniel Brooks for validation. They were looking at her, and that shift, subtle yet undeniable, was something Brooks could feel even without turning around, and it unsettled him in a way he had not experienced in years, because authority, once questioned, never quite returned to its original form, and he straightened his posture slightly, adjusting his glasses as if restoring control could be achieved through habit alone. But the room no longer responded the way it used to, and that realization sat heavily behind his composed expression. "All right," he said finally, his voice measured, careful. "That will be enough for today's demonstration." And the words sounded more like a retreat than a conclusion, though no one openly acknowledged it. And Emily gave a small nod, stepping away from the board without hesitation. Without waiting for further instruction, her movements quiet, composed, as if she had simply completed a routine task rather than dismantled the expectations of an entire room. And as she walked back toward her seat, something else changed. The same students who had whispered before now shifted slightly to make space, their eyes following her not with amusement, but with a cautious respect that had not existed before. And one student, seated near the aisle, hesitated before speaking, his voice low but sincere. "That was impressive," he said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that lingered. And Emily paused just long enough to acknowledge him with a polite nod before continuing, her expression unchanged, her focus already returning inward. And when she reached her seat, she picked up her notebook as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, flipping to a fresh page with the same calm precision she had shown at the board. And that quiet return to normalcy only deepened the impact of what had just happened, because it made it clear that for her, this was not a rare moment. It was simply who she was. And at the front of the room, Professor Brooks turned back to the board, his gaze lingering on the solution one last time before he reached for the eraser. And for a brief moment, his hand hovered, as if erasing it would somehow erase the shift that had taken place. But he knew it would not. And when he finally wiped the chalk from the surface, the faint traces that remained seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that some things, once revealed, could not be fully removed. And he cleared his throat again, attempting to re-establish the structure of the lecture. "We will continue with the next section," he said, though his tone lacked the certainty it once carried. And as he began to write a new problem on the board, the rhythm of the class resumed, but it was different now, quieter, more attentive, as if every student was suddenly aware that understanding could come from unexpected places, and that realization shifted the energy in ways Brooks could not control. And throughout the remainder of the lecture, something else became clear. Emily no longer blended into the background, even when she sat silently, even when she wrote in her notebook without raising her hand. There was an awareness of her presence, a recognition that could not be undone, and more than once, students glanced in her direction, not out of curiosity, but out of a subtle need to confirm that what they had witnessed was real. And at the front, Brooks continued teaching, his voice steady, his explanations precise, but every so often, his eyes would flicker toward the back row, as if drawn by something he could not fully understand. And when the class finally came to an end, the usual sounds returned, chairs scraping, voices rising, students gathering their belongings. But even in that noise, there was a difference. Conversations carried a different tone. Words like, "Did you see that?" and "How did she do that?" floated through the air. And as Emily packed her notebook into her bag, she moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, standing only after the majority of students had already begun to leave. But this time, the space around her did not feel the same, because the room had changed, and as she walked toward the exit, the path ahead of her opened without resistance, without dismissal, and behind her, Professor Brooks remained at the front, his gaze fixed on the now clean board, his mind replaying the moment he could not undo. The moment that had quietly rewritten the balance of his classroom. And though he did not say it out loud, the truth had already settled in, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet, undeniable fact, that the person he had underestimated was no longer someone he could ignore, and that from this point forward, nothing in that room would ever feel quite the same again. The hallway outside the lecture hall buzzed with a different kind of energy that afternoon, not the usual rush of students thinking about their next class or their weekend plans, but a quieter, more focused curiosity that seemed to follow Emily Carter as she stepped into the flow of people, her gray cardigan blending into the crowd the same way it always had. Yet something about her presence now resisted being overlooked, and as she moved past groups of students, conversations softened just slightly, not out of politeness, but out of awareness, as if her name had already begun to travel faster than she did, carried in fragments of disbelief and quiet admiration. "That was her, right?" one voice whispered. "Yeah, the one from calculus," another replied, and Emily did not turn, did not acknowledge. She simply continued walking, her pace steady, her gaze forward, as though the attention meant nothing to her. And in many ways, it did not, because what mattered to her had never been the room. It had always been the work, the quiet hours spent with notebooks and textbooks, the late nights under dim light when the world was asleep and equations made more sense than anything else. And while the students processed what they had seen, Professor Daniel Brooks remained behind, standing alone at the front of the now empty lecture hall, the silence heavier without the presence of witnesses, and he looked at the board again, now clean, as if trying to reconstruct the moment from memory, to find the point where things had shifted beyond his control, and his mind moved through every detail. The way she held the chalk, the clarity of her explanation, the confidence that had not asked for permission, and something about it refused to settle into the narrative he had built over years of teaching, because it suggested something uncomfortable, something he had spent his career avoiding. That expertise did not always come from the places he respected, and that realization lingered as he gathered his notes, slower than usual, more deliberate. And when he finally stepped into the hallway, he noticed the glances, the subtle looks from students who had once greeted him with unquestioned admiration, now mixed with something else, something quieter, more evaluative. And though no one said anything directly, the shift was there, and he felt it. And down the corridor, Emily reached the end of the hall where the afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, and she paused, briefly near a bulletin board, adjusting the strap of her bag as if grounding herself in something familiar. And for a moment, the world around her seemed to slow, the noise fading just enough for her thoughts to surface, not in celebration, not in pride, but in reflection, because what had happened inside that room was not new to her. It was simply rare that others were forced to see it. And as she stepped outside into the cool air, the campus stretched out before her, students moving in every direction, unaware that something had shifted in a single classroom just moments ago. And she walked toward the far side of the grounds where the buildings grew quieter, where fewer people passed, and where she could return to the rhythm she understood. But behind her, the ripple continued, conversations spreading, perspectives adjusting, and back inside, Professor Brooks stopped mid-step as a thought finally settled into place. Not a dramatic realization, not a sudden change of character, but a quiet acknowledgement that lingered beneath everything else, that he had not just misjudged a person, he had misjudged the very nature of what he believed expertise looked like. And that kind of realization did not disappear easily. It stayed, reshaping future decisions, altering the way he would look at the next quiet student in the back row, the next unassuming presence he might have otherwise dismissed. And though he would never say it out loud, the lesson had already taken hold, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through a single moment of undeniable truth, delivered without arrogance, without demand, and without a need for recognition. And as the day moved forward, as classes changed and the campus returned to its usual rhythm, one thing remained certain: the room may have emptied, the board may have been erased, but the shift that had taken place within those walls would not be forgotten. Because once a quiet voice proves its strength, it does not need to speak loudly again to be heard. The next morning, the lecture hall did not feel the same. Even before anyone spoke, even before the class officially began, there was a subtle tension woven into the air, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened and refused to let it fade into routine, and students entered more quietly than usual, Their conversations lower, more focused, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the back row where Emily Carter would normally sit. And when she finally walked in, nothing about her appearance had changed. The same gray cardigan, the same calm expression, the same quiet presence. Yet the way the room responded to her was entirely different. Conversations paused for a fraction of a second, glances lingered a little longer, and space seemed to open naturally as she made her way to her seat, not out of avoidance this time, but out of a kind of unspoken respect, and she sat down as she always did, placing her notebook on the desk, opening it to a fresh page, her movements steady and unremarkable, as if the previous day had not rewritten the way everyone saw her. And at the front of the room, Professor Daniel Brooks entered moments later, his posture as composed as ever, his suit as precise, his expression controlled. But there was something different beneath the surface, something subtle that only those paying close attention could detect, because confidence, once interrupted, never fully returns unchanged. And as he set his notes on the desk, his gaze swept across the room in the same practiced motion. But this time, when it reached the back row, it did not pass over Emily. It paused, just for a second, and that pause, though brief, did not go unnoticed. And he began the lecture as usual, his voice steady, his explanations clear, but the rhythm had shifted, the authority still present, yet no longer absolute. And as he worked through a new problem on the board, something unexpected happened. A student raised his hand, not to ask for clarification, but to suggest an alternative approach, something that had rarely occurred before. And Brooks hesitated for the smallest fraction of a moment before responding, acknowledging the idea with a measured nod. And the class took note of that too, because it signaled a change, not dramatic, not obvious, but real. And halfway through the lecture, Brooks turned slightly, the chalk still in his hand, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might call on someone, the familiar setup returning. But this time, his eyes moved across the room with more care, more consideration, and when they landed on Emily, there was no trace of mockery, no hint of condescension, only a quiet recognition that had not been there before. And he held that gaze for a second before looking away, choosing instead to continue the explanation himself. And the decision, small as it seemed, carried weight, because it showed that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how he saw her, but in how he approached the room as a whole. And Emily, for her part, remained exactly the same, her attention fixed on the material, her pen moving steadily across the page, her expression calm, as if she had no interest in the subtle changes unfolding around her. And yet, her presence influenced everything, not through words, not through action, but through the quiet certainty she carried. And as the lecture continued, the students engaged more, questions came more freely, ideas were exchanged with less hesitation, and the room, once defined by a single voice, began to feel more open, more dynamic, as if the boundaries had been adjusted in ways no one had expected. And when the class finally came to an end, there was no dramatic moment, no public acknowledgement of what had changed, but the difference was undeniable. And as students gathered their things, a few of them glanced toward Emily. Again, not with curiosity now, but with something closer to admiration, and one student, standing near the aisle, hesitated before speaking. "Are you coming to the study group tonight?" he asked, his tone respectful, almost cautious, and Emily looked up briefly, her expression thoughtful. "I might," she replied simply, and that small exchange carried more significance than it seemed, because it marked the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. And at the front, Professor Brooks remained for a moment after the class had emptied, his gaze resting on the board once more, but this time, there was no attempt to erase anything, no need to reconstruct what had happened, only a quiet acknowledgement that the standard he had always believed he defined had been expanded, and that from this point forward, he would have to teach in a room where excellence did not always announce itself, but when it appeared, it changed everything. That evening, the study room in the mathematics building carried a quieter kind of intensity, the kind that came not from pressure, but from focus, as a small group of students gathered around a long wooden table scattered with notebooks, laptops, and half-finished cups of coffee. And among them, Emily Carter sat near the edge, her presence still understated, her posture relaxed. as if she had always belonged there even before anyone had thought to invite her. And at first, the conversation moved cautiously, students exchanging ideas with a level of politeness that bordered on hesitation, as though they were still adjusting to a new dynamic, still unsure of how to interact with someone they had so recently underestimated. And one student, a tall young man named Jason, flipped through his notes before glancing toward Emily. "So, what do you think about the substitution method from today?" he asked, his tone careful. Not dismissive, not challenging, but genuinely curious, and Emily looked up from her notebook, her expression thoughtful as she considered the question. "It works," she said calmly, "but it adds extra steps you do not always need." And her voice carried the same quiet clarity it had in the lecture hall, steady and precise. And Jason nodded slowly, processing her words. "Can you show us?" he asked. And this time, there was no laughter, no hidden agenda, just a request rooted in respect. And Emily reached for a blank sheet of paper, her movements unhurried as she began to write, her explanation unfolding naturally, not as a performance, but as a conversation. And as she spoke, something shifted again, not in the dramatic way it had before, but in a deeper, more lasting sense, because this time, there was no authority challenging her, no audience waiting for her to fail, only a group of people trying to understand, and she guided them through the problem with the same efficiency, the same insight, her reasoning clear enough that even the more complex steps felt approachable. And one by one, the students leaned in, their earlier hesitation replaced by engagement, questions coming more freely now, not out of doubt, but out of genuine interest. And across the table, a young woman named Rachel paused mid-sentence before looking at Emily with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You make it sound so simple," she said. And Emily gave a small, almost hesitant smile. "It becomes simple when you understand the structure," she replied, and the statement, though understated, carried a depth that lingered, because it revealed something about the way she saw the world, not as a collection of difficult problems, but as patterns waiting to be understood. And as the session continued, the atmosphere grew more relaxed, more collaborative, the initial tension fading into something that felt natural, as if the group had quietly reformed itself around a new center of gravity, one that did not demand attention, but earned it through consistency. And for the first time, Emily was not invisible, not overlooked, but also not elevated in a way that felt uncomfortable. She was simply present, contributing in a way that felt honest and unforced. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Jason leaned back slightly, shaking his head with a faint smile. "I cannot believe we almost missed this," he said, the words more to himself than anyone else, but they hung in the air, echoing a realization shared by everyone at the table. And Emily did not respond, because she did not need to. The truth of it was already understood. And as the evening drew to a close, the group began to gather their things, the conversation lingering even as they stood, plans for the next session forming naturally. And as they stepped out into the cool night air, there was a sense that something had been established, not through a single moment of surprise, but through a quiet consistency that could not be ignored. And back in the empty study room, the papers left behind told the story in their own way. Equations solved more cleanly, ideas connected more clearly, and a space that had once been defined by uncertainty now carried the marks of understanding. And though no one said it out loud, the shift that had begun in a lecture hall had now settled into something more permanent, something that would not fade with time, because respect earned through quiet excellence does not disappear. It becomes part of the foundation, shaping every interaction that follows. And as Emily walked across the campus under the soft glow of streetlights, her steps steady, her expression calm, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for validation, because what mattered had already been proven in the only way that truly lasts, through the kind of understanding that speaks for itself without ever raising its voice. In the weeks that followed, the change did not fade. It settled, quietly but permanently, into the rhythm of the classroom, into the way students listened, into the way questions were asked, and most noticeably, into the way Professor Daniel Brooks taught, because something fundamental had shifted, not in his knowledge, not in his expertise, but in his awareness, and that awareness carried a weight he could not ignore. And one morning, as the early sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the lecture hall, casting long lines across the desks. Brooks stood at the front preparing for class, his notes neatly arranged as always, his posture composed, but his thoughts more measured than before. And as students began to enter, their voices low, their movements familiar, his gaze moved across the room with a different kind of attention, no longer scanning for errors, no longer searching for weaknesses, but observing, considering. And when Emily Carter walked in, there was no pause this time, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without words. And she took her usual seat, opening her notebook with the same calm precision, and the lecture began, not with a display of authority, but with a problem written cleanly across the board. And as Brooks stepped back, he looked at the class for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Before speaking, "There are multiple ways to approach this," he said, his tone steady but different, less absolute, more open. "I would like to hear your reasoning." And the invitation hung in the air, unfamiliar yet genuine. And for a moment, no one moved, the old habits still lingering, until a student raised his hand, offering an idea. Then another followed, and gradually, the room began to respond, not out of obligation, but out of engagement. And Brooks listened, really listened, evaluating each response with a level of openness that had not been there before. And then, after a few attempts, his gaze shifted naturally toward the back row, not as a challenge, not as a setup, but as a recognition. "Emily," he said, his voice even, respectful, "would you like to share your approach?" And there was no laughter, no tension, only a quiet anticipation. And Emily looked up, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before standing, her movements calm, unhurried. And as she walked to the board, the room followed her with a different kind of attention, not curiosity, not doubt, but trust. And she began to write her solution, unfolding with the same clarity, the same quiet confidence. And as she explained her reasoning, the room leaned in, not because they expected to be surprised, but because they expected to learn. And that expectation, built not on assumption but on experience, marked the final shift, the point where her presence was no longer an exception, but part of the standard itself. And when she finished, she stepped back, placing the chalk down gently. And this time, the silence that followed was not heavy, not tense, but full, filled with understanding, with appreciation. And Brooks nodded once, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement. "That is a strong approach," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that did not need to be emphasized. And as Emily returned to her seat, the class resumed, but the difference remained, woven into every interaction, every explanation, every moment of learning. And as the lecture came to an end, students gathered their things with a quiet energy, conversations continuing, ideas exchanged. And as Emily stood to leave, she moved through the room with the same calm presence she had always carried. But now, the space around her reflected something different, something earned, not demanded. And at the front, Brooks remained for a moment, his gaze resting on the board, not to analyze, not to correct, but to reflect. And in that reflection, there was a quiet understanding that extended beyond the classroom, beyond the equations and the lectures, something simpler, something more lasting, that respect is not given to those who demand it, but to those who reveal their worth without ever needing to raise their voice. And that day, without ceremony, without announcement, the room had learned something far more important than calculus. It had learned what true understanding looks like, and what quiet dignity can achieve when it is finally seen.